Introduction to Linux. The origins of Linux. In our last lecture, we defined what Linux is. We talked about what an operating system is and how Linux differs from other operating systems that we're familiar with. But where did Linux come from? I mean, did the current versions of Linux we're using just get invented out of the blue? No, they didn't. They were developed and evolved over time from other products that were created to solve specific problems. Linux is a multi-user and multitasking operating system. Multi-user, that means more than one user can be logged into the system at a time. We're used to that nowadays in this modern day of Windows operating systems. Windows is multi-user. Linux obviously is multi-user, Mac OS, all that. Back in the day, though, this was a big deal. Back then, systems were not multi-user. There was no concept of a user. Multitasking means to be able to do more than one thing at a time. Again, this is something we take for granted nowadays. We have absolutely no problem with having a Word document open on one monitor, a web browser open on the other, and they're all doing stuff at the same time. Back in the 50s and 60s, though, systems were not multitasking. They actually used batch processing. And the lack of having multitasking along with no concept of a user meant the system could only do one thing at a time. What did systems look like back then? Well, by the 1960s, they developed into mini computers. Now, about the size of a refrigerator. There's this teletype input-output system right there in place of a monitor. And in the 60s, these were extremely expensive machines. We're talking hundreds of thousands of dollars in their money back then. Well, if it's single tasking and it only has a single user, that doesn't make very efficient use of its time. A company has one of these machines, and let's say Bob from accounting and Sue from engineering both have compute jobs that need to be processed. This can only do one at a time. So something had to come. Something had to make this more efficient. In about 1965, MIT, in cooperation with General Electric, came up with the idea of a multi-user operating system for these systems. And what they developed was something called Multics. Well, that name makes sense, right? As you can see right here, this is the Multics shell. So just like every other operating system, it had a kernel, it had a shell, so forth. And it was intended to solve some of the earlier problems. Multics was conceived as a multi-user, multitasking operating system. Had one big drawback, though. It didn't work very well. So by 1969, AT&T and Bell Labs began development on another operating system called Unix. Unix is also multi-user multitasking, but it's meant to address the issues that Multics had. Its very name right here, Unix, is just a play on words from Multics. Multi, they decided to call theirs Uni, and instead of TICS, T-I-C-S, they use an X. Programmers, I mean, what can I say? Unix is actually the name. It is not an acronym. Okay. Well, AT&T succeeded in developing Unix and began distributing Unix operating systems, licensed the source code to other companies, and we began seeing proprietary Unix. Now, this Unix was run on systems that looked like this, right? We're talking about scientific workstations. This is the SPARC workstation. So by the late 1970s, early 1980s, these machines, tens of thousands of dollars, by the way, very powerful by their standards back then, were likely running Unix. And it had a desktop shell also. I mean, it's purely command line, just like Linux is, but there were also desktop environments that are vaguely reminiscent of Windows environments. Problem. If you wanted to use Unix, though, you had to have one of these systems. Well, like I said, they're tens of thousands of dollars. That's out of touch for most people for home use. This gentleman, Linus Torvalds, he was a grad student, a computer science grad student at the University of Helsinki in Finland. And at school, he was learning Unix. They had these guys right here. And he's learning how to write code and develop kernels and all this other kind of stuff. And what he wanted is to have a version of Unix he could run at home. Well, his pocketbook wasn't deep enough to buy one of these systems. He wanted something that could run on a regular PC. One of these things. What did we have for operating systems back then, though? Oh, DOS was a prime example. A single user, non-multitasking system for this, for the IBM PC and its clones. Early versions of Windows. There were no versions of Unix available for the PC's platform. So Linus made one. He's credited with writing the first Linux kernel. And he named it after himself. Linus Linux. Linux is actually part of the Unix family. But it's not Unix. He ported over none of the original code from Unix. He just went and duplicated it and rewrote it for an architecture based on the x86 operating system. Now notice what I said. He wrote the Linux kernel. He did not produce a version of Linux that was runnable. He actually published this right here, kernel version 0.01, back in 1991. And he released it to the world. Now this is pre-internet days, so it got put out on bulletin boards and all that. And other developers took it and started working with it. And over time, you can see here off to the left column, the kernel developed, eventually becoming a production version sometime around late 1992, 1994. This is an example of the kernel numbering system right here. And we're up to kernel version 4 point something something at this current point in time. But the numbering system is meant to have certain meanings. So let's look at, for example, at the latest version on the slide, 3.16.2. The 3 represents the major release. Now, major release of software is a fundamental change to that software. It is a big update to it. The next number over, the 16, is the minor release, right? So version 3.16. The minor release is an improvement over the earlier one here, over 3.15, but it's not enough change to constitute a major release. And then the last digit, .2, is the increment number. And we'll see a lot of these increments get released. Matter of fact, on kernel.org, the site we took a look at in the last lecture, we could see that there's Linux kernels being released almost daily, right? And Linus Torvalds still maintains control over development of the Linux kernel. So if he didn't develop the Linux distro, how did that come about? Other groups and other organizations took the kernel that he's responsible for developing, and remember, an operating system with just a kernel isn't a full operating system. We need the other pieces. We need the shell. We need specific software, the tools, device drivers, all that. Well, these various groups, Debian, Ubuntu, Red Hat, which is not listed on here, amazingly, SUSE, took the kernel, mated it with shells and different programs and different functionality, and released it as a distribution. A Linux distribution is something that you can actually download and install on a compute node. And there are a whole bunch of different distributions out there. This just lists a small fraction of them. If you go to the website distrowatch.com, it lists almost every distro that's available out there. And it's a great source for seeing what's out there, which ones to download, and so forth. And if you scroll down the page just a little bit, on the right-hand side, you're going to see the top 100 distros for any given day. And there's a lot more than this. And look at some of these names on them. We got Mint Linux, Debian Linux. Remember that from the previous slide? Ubuntu. OpenSUSE, CentOS, that one will be very familiar to you shortly. Puppy Linux, Lubuntu, and the list goes on and on and on. These are complete distributions. These are a kernel, a shell, the tools. You can actually install these. Keep in mind, though, not all distros are created equal. Some are hobbyist distros, not really intended for enterprise use. Some are enterprise-class distributions, like Red Hat Enterprise Linux. Then others are have very specific purposes. For example, to behave as a firewall or as a load balancer or something along those lines. And Linux is really in very, very, very common use. We just tend not to see it. The original developers of Linux, Linus, and the first people who were doing the distros like Debian and Red Hat, they started out with the idea that they were going to have an operating system to compete with Microsoft Windows, that end users were going to end up using it. Well, it didn't really pan out that way. A lot of it, I believe, is due to the fact there's so many distros out there. And they're not necessarily compatible with each other because they can vary greatly. But Linux is everywhere. And it's a huge part of the IT footprint. It drives a great part of the internet. Right? I believe 48%, I looked it up last night, 48% of all web servers on the planet as of today are based off of Linux. So a huge presence there. We don't actually see the web server when we're out there surfing the web. We see the web pages being hosted from it. So the Linux part's a bit abstracted to us, but it's there behind the hood. It's also used in all kinds of different devices. Now, the web servers are actually part of something called the LAMP stack. Again, 48% of web servers on the planet, approximately, are still based on the LAMP stack or some derivative of it. And that is an acronym. It stands for Linux, Apache, MySQL, PHP. A server with Linux as the operating system, a piece of software known as Apache, which is the actual web server software, the back-end database based on MySQL, using the programming language PHP. And taken together, they form the LAMP stack. Now, this has changed a bit. Apache is being replaced by a lot of other web servers. Nginx is another example. MySQL was actually used to be open source. It was bought out by Oracle. So there's other open source database distros that are used in this place and so forth. But you get the idea. Other places we see Linux, the firmware in network appliances. This is a Barracuda load balancer, and I believe underneath it is some type of, actually they're both load balancers, but you can also get Barracuda firewalls, Barracuda spam filters, and not just from Barracuda, any number of companies. What is this really? This is really a server, right? A lot of them are just Dell servers with the Dell faceplate ripped off and then the company's faceplate mounted to it. It's a regular compute node server running Linux as its operating system. And then some application software, in this case some kind of load balancing software, to give this appliance its functionality. Smartphones, mobile devices. The Android operating system is Linux. It was derived directly from Linux. It has a Linux kernel inside of it. Its shell is this desktop shell right here, the smartphone shell. And the Linux piece is kind of hidden from us, but you could download apps and crack it open and take a look at the file system and all that, and you'll see that it's based off of Unix, absolutely. Linux distros power all kinds of devices. Yes, even smart toasters. These things are actually a thing. And that's the whole point. Linux is everywhere. It's just not where we expect it to be. Remember, Linux is part of the Unix family. It is not Unix. It shares no common code with Unix, but it was based off of Unix. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me.